Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me for my talk titled You've Got Mail. As you saw in the agenda, this was meant to be a talk with two speakers. My colleague Muks Hirani could not make it, unfortunately, so I'll be doing this solo. So I work for a company called Mandiant, which specializes in incident response and is part of a company called FireEye. Both companies independently started probably 14 years ago, 2004. So we've been in the industry a long time and made our name different ways. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I won't talk about Muks because he didn't make it. My name is Dan Caban. I'm a Canadian. You might have noticed with the accent, I'm definitely not an American. People are making that mistake a lot. Hopefully you can understand my accent. If you can't, then you'll probably identify with me because I've been having trouble with some people at this conference. Northern accents are a little bit different. But I'm actually based out of Dubai, based out of the United Arab Emirates. So I came to this conference to share some things that I've seen doing digital forensics and incident response in the Middle East. So a lot of this are real case studies of an incident response where a suspected nation-state threat actor has compromised a government entity or a large organization, and the findings from that. And I've been in the industry for over 13 years, started my education over 15 years ago, and I've been specializing in just digital forensics and incident response for the last 6 years. And I'm bad at hockey. That's the thing I do. And because I'm Canadian, I mean ice hockey, not this field hockey thing that some people do. It's different. My Twitter handle is there. If you could follow me, that'd be great. I just signed up for Twitter this year, even though I've been in the industry this long, so I don't have many followers, or you can find me on LinkedIn. The agenda of the talk, we're going to talk about, it's all about email. We're going to talk about how to get access to email and what I've seen in the wild, and bypassing two-factor authentication. Is it really the second factor? And how we can post-exploitation attack the client using email. We're also going to talk about Webshells because I routinely see them on Exchange servers and the cool things we see. And we'll go a bit deeper into how something like Webshells are left on Exchange servers as well, called IIS modules and some transport handlers as well. And I want to show you some cool stuff with PowerShell as well, because again, this is common and how hackers are interacting with Exchange servers. So on the right, you'll see here, I've got some AOL CDs. This is from the 90s. If you're familiar with it, this is kind of the reference to You've Got Mail that most people expect. But I'm actually here in the spirit of Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks. Romantic comedy, I've got a soft spot for it. You've Got Mail. So the attack lifecycle that Mandiant presents from targeted threat actors looks like this. And the initial compromise phase is the most commonly associated with email and phishing. Phishing, essentially. Targeted phishing we see from red teamers, and we see from real targeted threat actors, and this is extremely common. But what you'll see in today's talk is it's beyond that. I already told you about Webshells, I told you about PowerShell, all these cool techniques. We'll go through the email infrastructure in a large organization fits into all of these categories. Establishing a foothold by leaving Webshells, escalating privileges by stealing credentials, doing reconnaissance through the tools they leave behind, and on, all the way to completing a mission, which could be stealing data or doing corporate espionage. So getting access. This is what I talked about, phishing. We see this every day, essentially, at Mandiant, where attackers are using phishing. And why are they doing this? Because it works. People are still opening attachments that are unsafe. People are still ignoring warning messages about how this is an unsafe operation, and attackers are still getting in. So the low to medium success methods we see attackers doing are the same thing that red teamers are doing. They're registering confusingly similar domain names. So if they wanted to target SteelCon, they may register mail-steelcon.info. Put up an email webpage and try to phish credentials. They may find other variants of generic top-level domains or even international top-level domains, so Unicode is confusing users even more. And of course, security alerts and whatnot. But what we see a lot of success in the Middle East from is abusing trust relationships. This is something that red teamers can't do. This is compromising one entity, like a government entity, and using access to their email through something like Outlook Web Access, and then sending a phish to a third-party organization where they do business, or maybe even intercepting a chain of email and replying to it with their phishing document. And the success rates go up dramatically. And this is a little visualization my colleague put together, essentially saying corporate defenses are high. We're looking for attacks coming from the internet from unknown third parties, uncategorized domain names, fresh registrations, but your partners who are providing services, products, hardware, software, they're the risk that you should be looking towards as well. So attackers are taking that route, essentially. So when I can, I'll pop up some recommendations based on like the blue team side of things of what you could do to, protect yourself. So the most obvious thing is you should stop doing business with third parties. Just close down operations. But some more obvious things, you should block uncategorized domains from some of the earlier things I talked about. You should harden your mail gateway policies, and you should two-factor all the things. Not just email, but all the things, anything remote access. And of course, educate your users so they're not going to make the mistakes of following through on these warnings that are presented towards them. Oh, it's animating again. So one of the inspirations for this talk is a very Middle East focused APT group that Mandiant announced last year, but we had been investigating since 2014. We call it APT 34. And they're a suspected Iranian-based threat group who are operating on behalf of the Iranian government. And because for various political and geopolitical reasons, they're attacking a lot of our customers in the Middle East. And they're hitting everything: financial, government, energy, chemical, telecommunications, the critical national infrastructure of the whole Middle East. Now, the way they're doing it essentially is just using a mix of public and private tools and doing phishing operations, spear phishing people that they find online through OSINT intelligence gathering. The same thing the red teamers are doing. And as we heard yesterday, if anyone attended the dark arts talk. So here's just a case study in a normal incident response engagement we did for APT 34 back, this would have been in 2015 when people were a little bit less prepared. An email came from a trusted third party and a business partner, essentially a supplier of hardware, sent an email that contained a macro. And the user ran the macro, enabled everything. It's okay. It's from someone I trust and it's okay with. They planted a backdoor. They escalated privileges using Mimikatz. They did lateral movement directly, and they targeted the Exchange servers to plant Webshells, so they had some persistence. And that's it. That was within 3 hours. They had essentially, I should say they also ran Mimikatz on the Exchange server, which gives them tons of credentials. So this was, in a matter of 3 hours, they had compromised the entire organization. And later we saw the Exchange server used to complete the mission to exfiltrate data. Not the same day, but later, where they had moved laterally, found the data they wanted, RAR'd it up, moved it to the Exchange server, and just downloaded it. And sometimes we see RAR files put directly on Exchange servers, or sometimes they'll try to be tricky and rename them to PNG or GIF and then download them. But when you see a 4 gigabyte GIF file downloaded from an Exchange server, it's not good news. And when you see 206 status codes, they're using a download manager to try to get it as quickly as possible. And this threat group especially is reading a lot of email. So it's not just massive exfiltration of stolen documents, it's espionage. So they're in the background quietly reading through VPN connections, primarily through Europe, through France. And this is kind of what a typical document looks like from this group. They put a compatibility warning at the top. This is just an image that they put in the Excel document, encouraging the user to accept all the warnings about macros. And what they did that was kind of unique back in 2015 is once you enabled the macros, then the content you expected was displayed. So the user definitely felt safe in what has just occurred and didn't report it to anyone. More recently, because we as FireEye and the security industry as a whole is saying to lock down PowerShell and ensure you have good PowerShell logging, we're seeing part of the macros included disabling PowerShell logging. So turning that off so there's no evidence of what occurred. So again, if I can, harden your email gateway attachment policies, sandbox them if you can, detect and block and look at child-parent process relationships. So Word should never be spawning PowerShell, and Excel should never be spawning PowerShell. And again, about logging, enhance logging, upgrade logging. If you can, enter constrained language mode, and if you can, block it from users who don't need it. This is a cool technique that can be used as well to get reliable ammunition. So rather than registering a confusingly similar domain name and setting up a website, you instead register a confusingly similar domain name and just start harvesting emails. And so here's an example where an imaginary company called worldarabbank.com did not also own this typo, worldarab with one B bank.com. So what our red teamers do is register that confusingly similar domain name. Nothing looks suspicious because there's no web page put up, but we're harvesting any emails coming towards it. And this is a real world example where an employee at an organization went out and maybe they were looking for an insurance quote, so they were looking for a travel agency quote, and they received an email. Sorry, the typo came from the person that they were talking to. They gave a business card and the person typed in the email wrong. So this is reliable ammunition. The user is expecting an attachment. The user is expecting an Excel document. So when you weaponize this and resend it from a similar account, the user's definitely going to open it because they're expecting it. So if you can, monitor for confusingly similar domain names and react. We've also seen abuse of Google OAUTH, essentially through strategic web compromises, encouraging users and redirecting users to grant privileges to their email. And a lot of corporations now are switching to cloud-based email services like Google. So essentially, you can give away the keys to your Gmail account. You can allow a third-party application that's maliciously been written to read your email, send your email, insert new documents and whatnot. And it's super secure because it's coming from Google and it's HTTPS. Here's a minor case study where a typical data, everyone gets phishing attacks. This is just a typical one where someone had harvested a lot of email addresses and they attempted to phish for credentials. They did this using a categorized website, like a website form builder that anyone could go to. So the proxy was not blocking it at the corporate level. And a few victims typed in their password and a few people reported it to security. And they were quick to respond. Within 5 minutes, they blocked the domain. They reset the passwords of the users they knew had received the email. And bravo, case closed. But what they didn't know is that same categorized phish was sent to a C-level who was on holiday in a different country. And he did not have it blocked on the proxy because he was not using the proxy. He was using a hotel Wi-Fi. And the attacker used the credentials through OAUTH to email a distribution group that goes to the whole company. So everyone received an email from the C-level saying, can you please visit this website and input your credentials? And they used a different categorized domain to do it. And it was blocked by the SOC. The SOC caught it. They realized immediately because they received it as well. But like any good employee, when they get an email from a C-level, they want to get things done. They want to show that they're a good employee. So they jumped on the guest Wi-Fi where there's no proxy at all as well and where it's not blocked. And that resulted in a little problem for them where 12 gigs of email was gone over 3 days because the threat actor did something very simple. Is he fired up a virtual machine and he synchronized email accounts using Outlook. Outlook just downloaded everything for him and he had access to the information he was looking for. So that was just over like a week period and there was a lot of lessons learned for this customer and a lot of data lost. So you should require laptops use VPN or some sort of NAC. So you have to use the policies of your corporation in order to access the internet. And guest Wi-Fi is for guests. And one thing I forgot to mention is the real reason the customer needed help from me was because a lot of Exchange servers that are still standing up today are using legacy security products like Microsoft TMG, Threat Management Gateway, which is actually at end of life. And its logging is going to like a MS SQL database, and the customer didn't know how to access it. And I had to walk them through finding out what the scope of the intrusion actually was. So the second factor. So we all know we're going to be compromised and we need to be ready to react. Two-factor authentication is very important to have. Two-factor all the things. And a lot of organizations we see now do have two-factor authentication. But is it actually foolproof? It's not, depending on how you implement it. So in one scenario, I was doing incident response for a customer, and they were using two-factor via text messages, one-time passwords, where you log in, you get a text message, and you input it to access. In this case, it was VPN. But I've seen the same problem with Exchange as well. And essentially, the customer had already been compromised for over a year before they implemented this two-factor. So all the attacker had to do, since they had domain administrator privileges already, is change the phone number of a user that was in the VPN group. And they changed the phone number to one of these online services where you can receive text messages. And if you ever check one of these services out, like in this screenshot right here, you'll see they're mostly filled with one-time passwords from web services and whatnot. It's people doing malicious things. And this was a major breach thanks to just changing a phone number. So what I did in this case, because I knew the customer had two-factor authentication, I knew it was SMS-based, I just told them to give me a list of every phone number for VPN-enabled account, and I sorted by essentially the country by number, and I found foreign numbers. I found some in Germany and Canada, in France, I think. And I looked at what those users were doing, and it was the attacker. And we later found way more evidence to prove that, but SMS OTP is not good enough, essentially. But you could be monitoring for changes to phone numbers and things like that. We've also seen two-factor bypass for VPN remote access. This one was VPN only, where they just use MAC address filtering, which most of you might know can be spoofed. And the email component of this, even though this was a VPN two-factor bypass, is that the attacker was just reading the email of the security people who were requesting the MAC addresses of the VPN-enabled users, and then reading the response, saying, okay, here's the MAC address. Okay, I'm just going to change my MAC address to this and log in as they were giving the accounts to third parties, actually. So the same customer enhanced their two-factor authentication method by doing RSA soft tokens that you can import into your phone using the same email account from a security team. And they were reading that email, so they're able to intercept the soft tokens and import them into their own phones. So, like, the implementation of your two-factor is extremely important. So, MAC filtering is not good enough, and you need to look into secure token delivery and storage. Storage is also important because on a lot of administrator PCs, we see the soft tokens left on the desktop for all these privileged users that have VPN access. If the administrator gets popped, all the accounts potentially could be compromised. And there's a lot of third-party applications that implement two-factor authentication. I'm not going to pick on Duo because I've more frequently seen custom implementations of two-factor done in various countries in the Middle East, but this is one that I know has the same problem. So to access your email, most people, when they think about post-compromise, where they've stolen your credentials, they think about OAUTH, Outlook Web Access. And Duo will protect you with two-factor authentication, but with the default way they recommend to implement it. But there's many different protocols and many different ways to access your email. There's Active Sync through your desktop client is a common one. There's Exchange Web Services, which is an API-based way to access your email. And by default, you can just access it with single-factor authentication. And I've seen this done before. Two-factor was useless because the attacker knew, don't use OA, use another protocol. So definitely study the protocols and methods, disable what you can, secure what you can't, because even though you think you have a solid way for security, there might be a way through. There might be just that one little gap, and your whole organization can be compromised. So, attacking the client. Here we're talking about post-exploitation, or at least post-having credentials of a user. A lot of settings about your experience in Outlook are synchronized with the Exchange server. Even though you change the settings in your Outlook client and you expect it to be only on your desktop, for convenience of moving around from computer to computer, they actually are stored on the Exchange server and can be synchronized. So if an attacker in step 1 were to get your credentials from, maybe you use the same username and password on the internet and they looked at one of these various dumps on Pastebin, they could change some settings on your Outlook client that would synchronize both internally inside a client zone on your desktop or externally. Let's say if you had a laptop at home, and let's say if you had no security at home because you're just a typical home user, there's no proxy, no firewall. So the most common thing people talk about is Ruler, which was released last year by SensePost, which there was many different ways they found you can abuse this process. But what we're seeing in the wild are setting rules to change rules on the user's Outlook client so they can essentially execute programs on the local computer. This is a feature of Outlook. You can open documents and whatnot. And setting a home page, which we're seeing in the wild right now. So in Outlook, you can also, when you go to your inbox, kind of at the highest level, see a web page, which could be convenient for corporate users to remind them about security, but it could also contain an exploitation, could contain a reverse shell. And that's exactly what we've seen. So here's just how you could do it natively as a user. You could change the home page by right-clicking on your inbox and setting it to SteelCon, and then suddenly your background will start showing up as SteelCon inside Outlook. And here's an example of an active IR of a home page that was set that I'm sure they use Ruler, but this can be done manually as well. They crafted a page that opens up a reverse shell using this homepage.exe, writes it to uses certutil, which is living off the land, again, referencing the dark arts yesterday, to download homepage to the program data directory, which is writable by all users. And every time the user opens their Outlook client, a reverse shell pops up for the attacker, and they're able to move laterally and attack. This was just posted yesterday on Twitter by my colleague, Nick Carr. I'm not sure where he found this, but he found another example of Ruler being used in the wild, where they were using an Empire downloader to leverage PowerShell to call back to the attacker server, and also potential responder usage. At the bottom here, you'll see a reference to a UNC path on a remote server. And if you attended the Dark Arts workshop yesterday, you'll see that's a way that you could potentially be stealing hashes, and the attacker could then crack the hashes and find out what your plaintext password is. So this is a real-world scenario. And because I'm a curious guy, I wanted to find a way to detect home pages being set for a customer. So I essentially looked at Ruler and I looked at the documentation from MSDN. And this is an example of how you can log into an account either on-premises Exchange, or you can also do an Outlook 365, and check to see if the home page has been changed, if essentially it's been set. And this is a one-liner way to do it. Not a one-liner, sorry. A simple way to do it in PowerShell, and it helps you to understand exactly what's happening. So the takeaways from this are, again, two-factor all the things, and patch your Outlook clients. Because all of these findings by SensePost were published, and there's a lot of excitement, a lot of both pen testers, and as we've seen, real threat actors are using it. So Microsoft did patch it. Unfortunately, the patch lifecycle of some customers we're seeing is atrocious, so they're still falling victim to this. SensePost also released something called Not Ruler, which is probably an easier way to detect it than copying and pasting that script out of my slide. So you can run that, and they also supplied some indicators of compromise of how you can find if you already have users compromised by Not Ruler. And as bonus points, if you like to copy and paste, I also, because I was interested, wrote a pure PowerShell way to set a homepage. So the documentation and the source code for a ruler made it clear the requirements to set a homepage. And this is one way you're able to do it. And it works successfully. Now, thankfully, as well, if you are patched, if you have upgraded your Outlook and you want to test and see that this works, you can always revert the security changes. Microsoft is helpful like that. They have set a register key to allow you to undo all the security that they've added to Outlook. So I don't know why anyone would do that, but Microsoft is very thoughtful in making that available to us. So now things are getting pretty cool, in my opinion, and stuff we've seen attacking the client. I saw a threat actor install a Outlook add-in, a plugin. There's lots of plugins for Outlook to help users to automate certain actions or to enhance their experience in Outlook. And this can be done using .NET code, heavily documented online and very clear. So what the attacker did, they put an MSI file on the client machine, and they installed this Outlook plugin, which dropped a DLL and some configuration files that were encrypted. When I did my testing and I opened up my Outlook, I could not see it in my list of Outlook add-ins. And these are the default add-ins for Outlook 2013. But what was actually happening in the background is a full-fledged backdoor was in my email client with capabilities to download, upload, execute, and load modular plugins, as well as just general beaconing of system information. And to make sure that the user didn't notice that this was happening, because it's all email-based, it's sending and receiving emails, they created folders and created rules to automatically move emails for C2 communication into that folder. And the properties of that folder were set so they were hidden. So the user in the left-hand column could not see this hidden, I think they called it a spam folder. So what gets even cooler is the emails going out containing system information, containing the results of remote command execution. It was actually using steganography as well. So in case the user found this in their sent items or an Exchange administrator saw a lot of these were going out, what they would have seen is just a normal HTML email saying something like, "Hi there." And in the signature of the email contained actually a really, really small triangle, sideways triangle. I've blown it up so you understand. But inside a chunk of that PNG was the encrypted C2 information. So it's a very stealthy way to both send and receive. So this is an example of a beacon going out. But here, there's also functionality for incoming C2 communication. So because it's .NET, we can fully decompile it, and it was not obfuscated, so it had clear function names we could read, like is mail for me. So it would process every email coming into the user's inbox, check for certain SMTP references, which is, if you've ever looked at email headers to trace emails, it's very complex and nobody looks at it, but that's one way it validated that it was actually C2 communications. And it validated by doing some sort of substring and looking at the MD5. And what it was looking for is images again, because it was using that same steganography routine for encrypting stuff going out and for decrypting things coming in. And it would just, they could either be an attachment to the email or base 64 encoded in the email, and it would decrypt that chunk and profit. They could do whatever they wanted on the Outlook client. So this is harder to find. You can hunt for Outlook clients by looking at certain registry parameters, and you can hunt for rules because this was moving it to a hidden rule folder that you might not expect. We found another backdoor in the Middle East doing the same thing from what we suspect is a different threat actor. This time it was not a .NET Outlook add-in, but it was a DLL that was installed on certain privileged workstations of users they were interested in. And this one is kind of telling the same story, where we had a backdoor capable of harvesting email, uploading and downloading data from the user's computer, and of course remote command execution. And they again chose to use a form of steganography, where C2 communications going outbound and inbound would be inside a PDF document, which had an embedded JPEG, I believe. It was an image anyway, which is, in this case, essentially empty. It looks empty. So if you open this attachment, if you manage to see it, it would just be completely white, but I've kind of selected it so you can see that an image is hidden in there. What's more interesting about this particular backdoor is that it was targeting multiple email clients, not just Outlook. It was targeting Outlook Express, Thunderbird, and a client called The Bat, which I had never heard of before. But I think it's a client made in Eastern Europe and popular in Poland and Russia. So it gives you some ideas of who the threat actor was targeting, or what geographical region, at least. So now I want to talk a little bit about web shells, because we keep seeing them on Exchange servers, like it constantly, and it doesn't stop. And I'd like it to stop. So on the right, you'll see a typical web shell where if you were to log in with a certain username and password, you would be given certain options where you can, upload, download, and do remote command execution. On the left-hand side, you see something called China Chopper, where it's very client-side based. And on the server, on the web shell, you just need a very small snippet of code, like this long. So instead of being very server-side, it's very client-side. So why is Exchange targeted so much for web shells? First and foremost is that every organization is looking for 100% uptime for their Exchange and their Outlook webmail. This is how we do business. They're supporting a business. Second of all, so we have the uptime, and second of all, it's a great place to hide web shells. I just installed the default 2013 Exchange server, and I found 584 files in 55 folders within the OAUTH or Exchange control panel folders. So there's a lot of different places you could drop in a new web shell, and there's a lot of different places that you could modify an existing script to contain either your little one snippet of code or drop in a whole blob. And in the early days of some of the threat actors, and this is probably coming back to APT34 again, we saw them doing simple things like dropping new scripts with confusingly similar names. For example, one, and I'm probably confused myself actually, one legitimate file in Exchange is eref.aspx. So they would create eree.aspx, confusingly similar. And I might have that backwards, but they're just picking similar names and dropping in web shells. And this is just validating that a password is set. And if the password is set, the attacker would have the option to execute remote code with the privileges of the Exchange web server. They started getting more tricky and trying to evade our detections by doing things like, instead of naming a parameter, because a lot of web shells will require a parameter name like command. That's very obvious, and a lot of web application firewalls would detect that. They started working with offsets instead. So you could name it, or everything you post to the web server or everything you get to the web server, which are two different methods of communicating with the web server, is put into an array of the ASPX script, and you can reference that by number. So here we see, how's my laser pointer work? Like this. I won't risk it. So instead of a named command, essentially they're doing math to find the right offset inside a long array of different parameters. So they've definitely built a client on their side in order to evade detection and bypass normal web application firewalls. And another cool technique we saw recently was a mixture of modifying legitimate scripts. Or no, that's all it was actually. So client-side JavaScript was modified. So when a user would come to Outlook Web Access and type in their username and password, they would, in the background, actually be posting their username and password to the log off script. So by modifying this JavaScript file, they changed the way the login page operated and pushed off credentials to the logoff.aspx page, which would then harvest those credentials and put them inside a file called ftp.ext.tlb. And one of the other changes that they made to the logoff script was the ability to take those credentials back. So now they have a script with very very little functionality, like remote code execution, but at any time they want, they can come get fresh credentials. They can get any user who's logged into OAUTH recently. And we saw what we believe is some automation on that end as well, where they would just every week harvest new credentials using a scheduled task, and they'd have fresh stuff to work with. And another web shell technique we've seen is dynamic web shells. So a lot of this has to do with executing code or uploading and downloading files. And if you look inside the source code of the ASPX, there's common things that you can scan for. If you had a web shell scanner for that server, you could look for process.start. In this manner, instead of having process.start embedded inside the script, they instead have put in the ability to compile source code. So there's nothing about execution, upload, download. There's only about compilation. So in this case, and instead of using post or get variables, they set the decryption parameters in cookies. So they again had a custom client where the data necessary would be set in cookies and hidden from almost all traditional logging you would see in an Exchange web server. And then they would, in the post data, actually put the commands they wanted to execute. So the script on the server would compile the code, and luckily we intercepted some of the cookies and some which contain the code, so we were able to see what they were trying to do. So we essentially took the cookies, took the encryption keys that were in the cookies as well, decrypted them, and output the source code of what was actually being compiled in memory every time that the attacker accessed the web server. We could see that they were trying to write some PowerShell scripts to a hidden folder, not a hidden folder, a traditional folder no one looks in called perflogs. So dynamic web shells is another way to bypass detection, not only for web application firewalls, but for anyone who is being proactive and scanning their servers for web shell references. So some recommendations from that: have a strong reverse proxy web application firewall and ensure that you have visibility into that traffic, because a lot of our customers actually don't. They're encrypting it for the security of their customers or of their end users, but they're not thinking about security, so they can't read what's actually happening. And file integrity monitoring can help you, so you know if there's been any changes. And the same process parent relationship concept, where IIS process should not be launching PowerShell on a traditional Exchange server. And make sure to segregate and protect your Exchange infrastructure, require jump servers to get to them, and just harden ACLs so only the real privileged users should access them. So that's the web shell side of things. And now the next level of what we keep seeing are actually, instead of putting an ASPX file on the server or modifying an ASPX, attackers are putting on DLLs. So the reason they want to do this is to evade detection again and to maintain persistence for a long time. Because a traditional web shell, like webshell.aspx, is quite obvious. You might have a get parameter, like command, containing who am I, which could be detected. Might have a post containing command, containing who am I, which could be detected. But with DLLs in IIS, and as well you can do this with PHP and Apache, there's similar methodologies, you can intercept the request at a higher level. So you could intercept the request for a legitimate logo.gif and have all your logic inside a DLL at a higher level than the script. So what looks legitimate in your logs is actually web shells being accessed. And here's a log example. I wrote actually an Apache module to do the same thing as these DLLs, where I was just getting the home page, and you see the size column is going up and going down because I'm doing different commands with the web shell, but you can't see it, and they're just GET requests. So IIS modules and transport handlers are kind of baked into IIS since version 7, and there used to be ISAPI filters previous to that. What we've seen in the wild are mostly native modules, but we have seen some managed modules as well. Managed modules are nicer for us because they're just .NET. So similar to that Outlook backdoor I showed you, we can just decompile it and find out exactly what it does. But native modules are more alluring to our adversaries because they They're C++, they're harder to reverse engineer, and they have higher privileges when they can have higher privileges when they're installed. And they can be installed just with the GUI of the IIS manager, or you can run a certain command remotely and live off the land, just use appcommand.exe, which is at the bottom of this slide. So here's an example of a managed module we saw on an Exchange server called Microsoft.exchange.client.auth.dll. And if you look at the managed and native modules, this seems like a normal file name, but it doesn't belong. And they modified a web.config to intercept any requests to auth.aspx with a capital A and essentially pre-process the requests with the source code snippet you see below. So this is something similar to China Chopper, where it's just one little snippet where they intercept a single parameter. In this case, it's HTTP handler 2016, and they eval it, they run it. So it's a very simple bare bones web shell, but it's hard to detect because it's inside a DLL, and it looks legitimate. Another threat group we see in the Middle East, another suspected Iranian threat group, is making use of native modules. And again, these were all found on Exchange web servers. Two examples we found were HTTP parser.dll, which both of them have an export function called register module, so they can be registered into IIS. And they both have similar functionality, the same functionality. One takes a cookie that's base64 and XORed, and it gives functionality to execute using the command parameter, command $sign parameter, upload using the upload $sign parameter, or download using the download. And actually on the same Exchange server, a couple months later, we saw them drop HTTP module, so we kind of can see the evolution of how they're trying to make their modules better. So this second module added a second layer to ensure that the communications coming to the web server were from the attacker to secure it from any other adversaries that might try to take over. So it was checking to see if the 25th HTTP header was default-Windows. And if it was, then it would move on to execute using RC, upload using UF, and download using DF. And those parameter names are much less likely to be detected by any web application firewall. And the kind of third layer down of what we're seeing now is transport agents, which essentially allows you, instead of enhancing IIS, you can enhance Exchange itself. So Exchange is modular. Microsoft is great in many ways to allow third parties to make Exchange better. So here's a little verbiage about the transport pipeline, but essentially think of a good example is in some organizations, when you send out an email, you automatically have a customized signature put into it. That's an example of someone that's enhanced the functionality of Exchange. So attackers are leveraging that same well-documented methodology and making their own code. So we saw an attacker on an Exchange server plant a DLL that, again, is using C2 commands encrypted inside PDF and JPEG attachments because they really want to evade detection. And it had complex Boolean logic on what they wanted the backdoor to do. So it was very configurable using these configuration files. So they knew what kind of attachments or subjects or senders they were looking for, and they could steal them essentially appropriately. So the next slide shows some of the functionality of this transport agent, and some of it's scarier than before because we keep seeing remote execution, we keep seeing upload, download, but here we also have functionality like change the content of an email or block an email. If they want to manipulate an organization, they can actually, they're in full control and they're in that transport pipeline. So they can manipulate how you communicate with third-party organizations, how they communicate with you, and internally as well. So it's pretty scary. So the only recommendations I can think about these DLLs is application whitelisting. And if you see anything like this on your Exchange infrastructure, seek help, because these are the serious guys. These are the nation state or state-sponsored threat actors. So running out of time, but I'll quickly gloss over some PowerShell, Exchange Control Panel, and Exchange Web Services stuff that I've been playing around with. And this is not so much real world scenarios, but something that you can be hunting for if you're on the blue team like I am and you're a defender. So if you have PowerShell access using Exchange Web Services, which a lot of organizations do, and definitely those in the cloud do, you can open up a PowerShell session with your Exchange server and you can start manipulating things if you have the right privileges. As a normal user, you can set your own SMTP forwarding address. So all email coming to you is forwarded to a third party. And this is a popular technique used in business email compromises where they're trying to get inside an email chain of someone working in finance and try to forward money to a different third party. So that's on the top an example of a commandlet that can be used to set to a third party email address. And at the bottom, I wrote a one-liner to detect. Basically, iterate through, if you have the right privileges, iterate through all the email boxes in your organization and see if this forwarding address has been set. And I named our victim here Poor Bloke because I think bloke is British slang and I wanted to fit in with you guys. Another thing you can do is set rules based on certain keywords or parameters. So perhaps if you were a financial threat actor, you were looking for subjects containing the word invoice and you want to forward that as an attachment to myself, you could do that using the new inbox rule commandlet. And below there, I gave you, it's not quite one line, but if you were to, I didn't have enough room, it is a one-liner, to scan for any, anyone in your organization who has any forwarding, either forward as an attachment or forward the whole email or redirect the email to at all. Because it might not be that common in your organization. This is something that I have seen in the real world scenario, which is exporting entire PSTs of users. I've seen this quite frequently, actually. So post-exploitation, they have domain administrator, they're moving around, they find a user of interest, and they want to take their whole inbox, the whole PST. So Microsoft, to help Exchange administrators, gives you a commandlet called new mailbox export request. And you can give yourself the privileges, if you're already a domain administrator, to do this. And usually organizations are doing this for troubleshooting or backing up emails. So there's already a network share set where you can export this PST to. And I was doing an IR in the Middle East where we caught this in real time, and the PST they were exporting was the person who engaged us, the head of risk. So it was a bit of a wake-up call and proof that when attackers compromise an organization, they're definitely reading the email of the security team. It's actually the most interesting thing to read for them, so they know if they've been detected and how they're planning to remediate. And this is another common thing that I have seen in real world scenarios, which is if you have these elevated privileges, you can leverage the e-discovery functionality of Exchange. So with e-discovery, if you guys aren't familiar, often you need to collect documentation or emails from an organization based on certain keywords because there might be a lawsuit going on. You might need to do a litigation hold. So what attackers are doing in the real world is leveraging that functionality to search for things that they're interested in, like passwords. And I'll show you some examples here. And just one tidbit of information since I'm running out of time. By default, this goes into a mailbox called Discovery Search Mailbox, and there's a particular GUID which is unique to all installs of at least Exchange 2013. So this is a mailbox that once you run a search looking for passwords, it'll go across the whole organization, collect all the emails containing passwords, and put them inside this mailbox. So the attacker can, through Outlook Web Access, just go into that mailbox and start reading every email across your whole organization containing the word password. And here is a real world example of where an attacker had done this. They had searched for VPN access and password because they had found that this was the standard terminology when they gave out new VPN accounts. And this is kind of like the progress email you get at the end when it's done. It went into this Discovery Search mailbox and it said that it found 701 megabytes worth of emails containing VPN access and password with how many objects? 607 emails. So they knew what they were looking for and they got it. And you can do this again through a commandlet. Just do a new mailbox search. You can call it what you want, litigation hold. You're looking for VPN access and password. And you can send the status emails to a different email if you wanted, like Exchange admin. This is just something I have in my lab. Final note, because I do have a couple more minutes, I will talk to you about how you can do forensics using Exchange as well, because it's common with business email compromise, and it's common with large-scale incident response like what we're doing as well. So you can, by default, Exchange does not have audit logging enabled, but audit logging gives you a lot of great information you'll need, like who has logged into an account. So you'll have to turn that on if your organization hasn't already, and it will give you the ability to find all these wonderful things, like when someone sends a message using send as, or someone logs into an account. But the fact is a lot of our customers haven't turned on audit logging when they call us, so it's too late. But there's a lot of good documentation that's just started leaking out now about activity logs on Outlook 365. There was a lot of chatter in the forensic community about this secret way to access the history of what's going on inside a Outlook 365 install. And CrowdStrike documented it and put it in a blog a couple weeks ago. So this is a hidden API using a REST API that Microsoft has put on by default. So even if you didn't have auditing enabled, you can find out all this great information, like when there was a log on, or someone did a search, someone moved or read an email, the kind of stuff you'll need to answer if there's a business email compromise. So go ahead and take a look at the new Activities API that's picking up right now. So that's the end of my talk. Just want to remind you, email is important. Email is something we see every day in an enterprise scale incident response, and it's across the whole attack lifecycle of targeted threat actors. That's it. Thank you.